I'll share a few of the stories with you. And the one really that was the most astonishing. I was at breakfast, again, there's always had leftover food, with my Uncle Joe in Chicago. And he was very upset that morning because he had been doing some voter registration. And he was frustrated that he could not get young people to take voter registration seriously. He was really upset by this because he just thought that they didn't understand all that had been done to make sure that they had the right to vote. And he just couldn't understand it. And so I was having some Tex-Mex omelet, huevos rancheros kind of thing, and he was having oatmeal, as he does every morning. And he was stirring that oatmeal and fussing at me and stirring the oatmeal and fussing, and he was so upset talking about how these young people just don't understand how easy they have it and they take all this for granted. And you know your father was shot. We're at a restaurant. And he just spits this out. He said shot, S-H-O-T. And when I heard this, I was shocked, S-H-O-C-K-E-D, because I didn't know what he was talking about. My father, who died in 1988, was a postal worker. Both my parents were postal workers. He was a very quiet man. By today's standards, you would probably say he was kind of zen. He didn't speak a lot, but when he did speak, he had this sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi thing, where when he said something, it was really wise, and everyone would go, ooh. It was kind of like an E.F. Hutton kind of thing. He would just kind of watch everything, and then pearls of wisdom would come forward. He was particular in his manner and in his dress, and in the way he insisted that his children dress. And he kept his cars beautifully, maintained his home beautifully, and was not someone who was pugilistic in any way. He had strong opinions, but he had an elegant way of expressing them, and thought that the best way to get what you wanted in life was not necessarily to get in somebody's face, but to present them with facts that they had to respect. So the notion that my father was involved in any kind of altercation just didn't fit the picture. And I hadn't heard anything about this. So I was trying to find out what my uncle was talking about. And he could see immediately after telling me this that he had said something that he regretted. Have you ever said something and you wish that the words had a handle on them? Oops, sorry I said that. Let me just pull that right back. And that was one of those moments where he could see that he had upset me, and that he, in a moment of disinhibition, had said something that perhaps he shouldn't have said. And so I got a little bit more out of him that morning. That it happened after the war. My father was a very young man, that he was with another one of the brothers. There were 6 boys in the family, 6 sons, and one of them was with him that night. But then he sort of clammed up. I visited him again, made several calls, tried to get him to open up. He didn't really want to say much. So then I started to circle on all the family members, all the cousins, because we have a lot of actual cousins. I come from a big family, but then we had that second category of cousins that were like C-U-Z cousins. They weren't really cousins, but they were part of the kind of big broad family. And I went to them and tried to get them to talk about it. And I found that I got one of 2 reactions. Either people were very upset and they would treat me as if I were still 10 years old, and they would fuss at me, girl, we don't want to talk about that. Why are you asking us about that? Maybe people hadn't talked about it for a reason. Have you ever thought about that? They just would not talk to me. And there was another category of people who were saddened. Their shoulders would heave. Oh, now you know. I knew something I wasn't supposed to know. And I had to keep pushing. And I had to keep pushing, because the more I learned, the more I had to know. And the more I knew, the more I had to learn. I was caught in this cycle. Like I said, it was a current, and it was pulling me someplace. From the family, I was able to learn more about what happened on February 7th. From my digging that I was able to do and use my skills as a journalist, I was able to then add to that through documents research and through historians and through going back to Alabama and really going through everything I could to find out as much as I could about this incident. What I learned, and I'll give you, you'll learn much more about it in the book, but what I learned is that my father had returned to Birmingham, Alabama in January of 1946, having served in the Navy. He enlisted in the Navy as a very young man, and as a man of color was sent to the naval station at Great Lakes in Illinois. And when you enlisted as a man of color in 1943, I'm sorry if the dates are getting fuzzy for me, he was right out of high school, it's 43. And when you were a man of color at that point, you had two choices. You could serve as a steward or as a cook. The military was not integrated. The Army was accepting men of color. The Navy was one of the last, was lagged behind the Army in taking men of color and allowing them to serve more fully. My father wound up serving as a cook, which meant that he wore a C on his arm, because that's what you did at that time. And if you were a steward, you wore an S. Men of color sometimes were allowed to serve in a special branch where they played music, and there were some jazz musicians that maybe you listened to, people like Clark Terry, who were in the band, and so they wore a musical staff. And what I learned in talking to a number of these older men who are living and who share their stories with me, that they got all the women when they would go on leave to Chicago. that women would see that musical staff and they know that there was a higher grade of pay and attached to it, and perhaps entry into some cool clubs on the south side of Chicago. But my father served as a cook. And over time, when the military had decided that the marginalization of men of color was essentially material aid to the enemy, he was able to move up into other opportunities presented themselves, and he was able to lead the cook's branch and actually served in Williamsburg and in San Francisco and Pensacola, Florida. Oddly enough, places where we always vacationed. When I learned about his military service, I realized that it was the sort of map of our childhood vacations, something that was quite surprising to my mother because she hadn't realized that either. He was sort of going back with his family, and you can surmise why he might have done that. You know, with his kids in tow, dressed as we always were to the nines. He was released from the military in January and returned to Birmingham. And he was going out on a Thursday night with his brother and a family friend, John B. And they were attempting to go to a building called the Pythian Temple. He was trying to enter an elevator. And a policeman put out a billy club and tried to stop him. And my father refused to step back. He asserted his right to enter this elevator in this public building. And a scuffle ensued. And in that scuffle, a policeman drew his gun. And the gun was at first pointed at my father's chest, midsection of his body. And my Uncle Woodrow reached out and swatted the gun. And when the gun discharged, it grazed my father's leg. And he wound up with a superficial wound. So I sort of had the facts, but it still wasn't enough. I found the police records from that night. It turned out he was arrested. After he was wounded, he was arrested, spent a night in jail, returned a few weeks later, and had to pay a fine. A significant fine, which was quite a blow to the family, because we were not a family of means. And they had to pay money to get him out of jail. Another one of the brothers had to provide that money that was part of his military stipend, which explained a little tension between those two brothers that existed all their life, and suddenly I understood what that was all about. But I still had, even though I had the facts of the story, I had to understand why my father would stand up to a police officer, because again, this didn't match his personality. And if you know anything about American history, if you know anything about Birmingham history, for a black man, even if you were wearing a uniform, even if you were feeling your manhood, even if you were sort of smelling yourself after you were honorably discharged from the military, for a black man to stand up to a police officer in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946 was to invite a special kind of trouble. I had to understand why he would do that as a young man. What I discovered, you know, I talked to you about how the older people in my family had something shift inside of them. What I discovered had made something shift inside of me. What I discovered is that he returned to Birmingham in 1946 and returned to a city that had been transformed. Birmingham was a city where there was quite a bit of manufacturing going on during the war. So it was a boom town. And it was also a place where a large number of recruits or enlistees had come from, because when the military decided to open up the ranks to men of color, marginally at first, Birmingham was one of the cities where they did a lot of recruiting, because Birmingham at that time had the largest high school, the largest Negro high school in all of America. It was called Parker High. Many people that you know and have read about in America have come out of Parker High. It is, if you know anything about Birmingham, it is a grand institution. It was large, so large that they had classes that operated in the morning and in the afternoon. 2 graduating classes in January and June of each year. All of the teachers had PhDs, because when you got a PhD at that time, and if you were a person of color, there wasn't a whole lot that you could do with it. So many of them started teaching. So the quality of the instruction in this high school was tantamount to almost a college at that point. And it was so well known that people from all over Birmingham would send their children there. Sometimes move to Birmingham, send their kids to live with relatives so they could have a piece of Parker in their life. And so when the military was looking for men of character, that's one of the places that they went. And as a result, at the end of the war, all of these black men were streaming back to Birmingham because of that Parker connection. And they had come back to Birmingham as men who were slightly transformed. Actually, not slightly, they had been greatly transformed by their military experience. I know this because I never had a chance to talk to my father about this, but I spent time talking to many veterans about their experiences. And when they came back, they wore the uniform, and that uniform changed them. Because in wearing the uniform, they saw white men who were wearing the uniform. They felt like they were part of America in a different way. They left societies where they were told where they could live and eat, and where they could use the bathroom, which water fountain they couldn't use, when they could use the library, which dressing rooms they could use. But suddenly when they put that uniform on, it opened up a world of possibilities for them. And they participated in the fight for democracy. And then when they returned to Birmingham, they had this kind of crazy idea that maybe they would get a taste of that democracy back home. They figured, I fought in the war. Now I should have the right to vote. And America wasn't ready for that. And Birmingham at that point was the epicenter of a voting rights campaign that at that point, this is before the Civil Rights era, was largely focused on black veterans. They were marching through the streets. Imagine that. Black veterans marching 4, 6, 8 across in lockstep through the streets of Birmingham on their way to City Hall to assert their right to vote. And they were always turned away. There were only a small number. There were less than 400 people of color who were allowed to register in a city where 100,000 should have potentially been on the rolls. One of the reasons they were turned away is Birmingham at that moment, or at that time, had passed something called the Boswell Amendment. It was in response to a Supreme Court case. And the Supreme Court, just a year before that, had outlawed white-only primaries in the South. And when that happened, that sent a ripple of fear throughout power centers throughout the South, because there was a worry that if people of color were allowed to register in large numbers, it would upset the apple cart. It would change the political structure of the South. And so different states handled it in different ways. In Birmingham, they passed something called the Boswell Amendment. The Boswell Amendment held that if you wanted to register to vote, you had to prove that you understood, that you knew and understood any portion of the Constitution that the registrar pointed to. And so these military, these men, these veterans who had come back said, okay, you want us to know the Constitution? We're going to learn more about the Constitution. By today's standards, the kids would say, game on. If you want us to know about the Constitution, that's what we're going to do. So remember, I told you my father was going to the Pythian Temple. The Pythian Temple was one of 2 black-owned business buildings, office buildings. And it was filled during the day with doctor's offices, dentist offices, social clubs. But in the evening, those offices were transformed into classrooms. And men of color were going to these classrooms at night to learn as much as they could about the Constitution.